Imagine a situation where your own pet goes rogue, and Calvin is one such creature that violates all the rules of the master-pet relationship. Calvin is a character and the main villain in the 2017 science-based fiction horror film titled Life. Daniel Espinosa directed the movie, and Paul Wernick and Reese wrote it. The movie had an A-list cast consisting of Jake Gyllenhaal, Reynolds, Rebecca Ferguson, Hiroyuki Sanada, and Ariyon Bakare. A group of 6 astrophysicists working at the International Space Station find the presence of an alien on planet Mars, which triggers a series of events leading to the heinous ending of all the crew members. What was their fault? Under the honest intention of experimentation, they reared this alien to life only to know that they had released their own death certificates in doing so. The crew gets caught off guard by the brevity of the alien working its way into the spacecraft and destroying the lives of those who gave it life. The movie was released on March 24, 2017, and despite mixed reviews, it grossed $100 million across the world. Here's a detailed look at this dreaded villain called Calvin. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
Get out of here.
What is Calvin's origin, and where was it discovered? Set in the future, the International Space Station sends a robotic spacecraft, better known as a space probe, to planet Mars. It was equipped with scientific instruments and capable of gathering materials from the targeted place for which it had been sent. The space probe returned with some soil samples that showed signs of extraterrestrial life on Mars. Exobiologist Hugh Derry of ISS works on the sample from which a dormant cell is revived. A multicellular organism grows from this dormant cell, and to make it inclusive, the ISS announces a naming contest of the organism, wherein school children vote through a live feed and end up naming the organism Calvin, which was named after their elementary school, Calvin Coolidge. A few days pass, and the sample is kept in isolation in the lab to perform experiments and study it further. Hugh Derry inspects the sample and makes all the arrangements to make the atmosphere conducive for the growth of the organism. It was evident that the lack of oxygen on its home planet made the organism dormant. After programming the atmosphere with high CO2 and a measurable amount of oxygen, an ambient temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, along with a glucose growth medium, the single cell begins to develop. A few days pass, and on day 12, Hugh figures Calvin had grown appendages and had developed interactive skills. A few more days pass, and on day 25, due to an erroneous atmospheric temperature breach, Calvin becomes dormant, i.e. back to its basic state. Hugh realizes the lack of air in the planet's atmosphere has made the cell dormant. The atmospheric change in the lab drives Calvin into hibernation. Since Hugh had gotten attached to Calvin, he revives it with an electric shock, triggering Calvin to become a violent being. Hugh hadn't expected Calvin to change so suddenly, and was caught off guard when Calvin crushed his hand and escaped from the incubation lab, while releasing a lab rat on the way. Calvin's growth makes it more formidable, so when engineer Rory Adams tries to save Hugh, he pulls at his leg, forcing Dr. Miranda North to shut the lab from all sides. Rory tries to fire and burn down Calvin, but fails since it attacks him by going down his throat and consuming all of Rory's organs. A vent in the lab leads to Calvin's escape. The ISS communication shuts down before the crew can inform Earth, leaving an incomplete message. Ekaterina Golovkina, nicknamed Kat, the space station's commander, does a spacewalk to repair the communication system, but Calvin charges an assault, damaging her spacesuit. Coolant starts to fill up in the suit due to the damage, so Kat makes it back to the airlock, but she's no match for Calvin's ravenous attacks and dies trying to keep the organism out of the space station. But unfortunately, Kat's sacrifice is in vain, since Calvin hitches himself to the station before she floats into space. Calvin desperately tries to re-enter the space station by maneuvering the thrusters. In retaliation, the space station crew fires to blow away the thrusters, causing fuel depletion and driving the space station into a decaying orbit. Entering a decaying orbit means the space station would self-immolate once it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Sho Murakami, the system tech, had a suggestion, which was to use up whatever fuel was left to ensure they entered a stable orbit. Although a stable orbit wouldn't prevent Calvin from re-entering the space station, it would help them buy some time. An injured Hugh tells the crew that whatever they did, Calvin would re-enter in one piece, endangering their lives. So the crew sealed one part of the space station and quarantined themselves. They sealed the other side to isolate Calvin so that they could target him by venting the atmosphere to kill him. But the crew didn't know that smart Calvin had hitched himself to Hugh's leg. Being a paraplegic, Hugh wasn't aware that Calvin was beneath him, but when he realized it, it was too late. Calvin uses him to get out of the quarantine area marked for the crew. Calvin feasts on Hugh, and by the time the crew discovers him, it's too late. Hugh has suffered massive blood loss and collapses. Each time Calvin consumes biomass, it grows. Hugh's death makes Sho lock himself away in a sleeping pod as Calvin tries to enter. Other crew members, David and Miranda, Miranda hold on to Hugh's corpse, hoping to use it as bait to trap Calvin. In a fighting state of mind, as the crew vents the atmosphere from Calvin's area, a spacecraft is spotted approaching their space station due to Miranda's SOS. As they vent the atmosphere from Calvin's area, a spacecraft approaches the space station. As per the emergency protocol, any distress signal in space would require Earth station to send a Soyuz spacecraft, specially designed for such crises. The Soyuz consists of 3 modules: the descent module for crew to launch, the orbital module that provides living space and storage, and the service module that provides power and propels the spacecraft. Modules 2 and 3 are discarded before re-entry. However, Tech Show, thinking the spaceship was an intruder and not a rescuer, opens the exit to the new craft, leading Calvin to follow him, who massacres the Soyuz crew. Due to the massacre, the opening to the airlock that stood between the Soyuz and the space station was compromised. Realizing his mistake, Show gives himself up to propel Calvin into space. The damage caused to the Soyuz leads it to getting disconnected and crashing into the space station, pushing the space station once again into a decaying orbit. Not willing to give up, David and Miranda try to trick Calvin into an escape pod, and he falls for the bait. David launches the pod that held Calvin into deep space, freeing Miranda to return to Earth in another pod. David keeps Calvin distracted by giving him oxygen sticks, and launches the pod. Meanwhile, Miranda, who has launched her pod, uses the black box to inform the Earth crew about Calvin's agility, IQ, and notoriety. But as luck would have it, both pods get hit by the drifting debris from the recently destroyed Soyuz. One pod lands near a coast in Vietnam, where the fishermen peep inside the pod to see David enveloped by Calvin. Despite desperate pleas from David, the fishermen open the door of the pod to meet their fate. Elsewhere, Miranda's pod drifts away from Earth into deep space as Miranda screams for help. Appearance. While it's difficult to describe Calvin's appearance since it's like a white translucent fluid-like thing with multiple heads, its skin is so translucent that one can see its entire circulatory system beneath it. As Calvin starts feasting on live animals and humans, his appearance gets scarier and more hideous. Powers and abilities. Calvin displays inhuman strength, visible when he breaks Hugh's hand and crushes it with little effort. When David entrapped Calvin in the pod, he found himself caught in Calvin's tentacles. It was horrifying to see David stuck as he watched himself being fed upon by Calvin. Calvin's immense strength derives from the fact that his consumption is directly proportional to his growth. For instance, when he gobbled the lab rat, he started growing. His growth can be termed as disproportionate, and unlike that of humans. By way of diet, Calvin is largely carnivorous and feeds on anything that moves or doesn't move. This streak is seen when he consumes David's insides and comes out looking disproportionately big. His power to consume anything and everything that came his way gave him the edge to be miles ahead of his opponents. While the crew was panicking with Calvin's threatening presence, Calvin, on the other hand, was thriving under this crisis, and most importantly, growing. Calvin's shape-shifting abilities grant him access through the thickest walls and narrowest crevices. He could withstand extremes, such as high temperatures on both hot and cold scales. Although Calvin required oxygen like any other organic organism, Calvin could live without the elixir of life for long periods, justifying his ability to survive in a vacuum. Calvin possessed specialized cells that could act as muscle, neuron, and photosensory cells all at the same time, making him see light and sense things around him. He possessed multifunctional cells that performed all kinds of sensory functions simultaneously, which is based on a concept called extremophile replication, derived from abiogenesis studies. Calvin's pattern followed preying upon victims, making them immobile using his tentacles, and then feasting upon them by secreting digestive enzymes. Was Calvin's villainy justified against a bunch of highly educated scientists? Some of my favorite moments in the movie that scored the imagination were how Calvin consumes the insides of the crew members and emerges from the victim's mouth. However, I couldn't bring myself to believe the disparity in the IQ levels between Calvin and the scientists. Why couldn't the crew tame Calvin, since they all had years of experience and the requisite qualifications to know how an alien works? I also had difficulty accepting that no hero stood out in fighting Calvin, and the ending felt very defeatist. Marvelous verdict. A myriad of questions comes to mind when I try to conclude this script. Who was Calvin? Who created him? Why did the atmosphere in the incubation container go awry? Although a movie, it drives us to think that as humans, we created a villain due to our carelessness. Calvin wouldn't have been made had the space probe not gone to Mars and meddled with the planet's balance. Why bring someone or something from another place just for sheer experiment? Is this called progress? If so, I'd like us to rethink this a bit. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.